We are here with Aaron Cassidy. We are really glad to have him this year at Mixtur. Of course, he had to come to Barcelona in the first plan, but for evident reasons, it was not possible finally. But fortunately, he accepted to do this lecture online. So thank you for that, for adapting to these circumstances. And I would I also like to say that this year the festival commissioned an electroacoustic piece to Aaron Cassidy, and this piece will be premiered tomorrow at the electroacoustic concert in Barcelona at the Phonos Foundation. So maybe as a complement of this conference, for those being in Barcelona, you can come. It will be at 8 p.m. and you'll be welcome to that concert also. So the content of the conference is really up to Aaron. You can talk about your work. I am sure they are all interested on that. And so I give you the word, and thank you again for being here.
Yeah, well, thank you very, very much for having me. And I hope it's clear. Well, in fact, I hope it's obvious that I'm really disappointed that I'm not there. I was really looking forward to being there, and it's a city that I absolutely love. And I was really hoping to come back. So hopefully sometime in the not so distant future, it'll be possible to all be in person.
Well, we'll try, yeah, that's for sure, yeah.
So, and I just sort of wanted to say to everyone in the group, I mean, I can see some, but quite a few without video. I've been doing a lot of this kind of thing over the last 6 months with guest lectures and various bits of teaching and whatever else. And my experience so far over that time is that the more kind of formal lecture presentation thing often doesn't work quite well, and it's difficult to juggle all of the screen sharing and audio sharing and notes and whatever else. So my preference, if it's possible, is to keep this pretty informal and conversational. So I'm going to try and build in some spots along the way for some questions to open things up so that we can actually talk. But also, if there are things along the way where something is unclear, or you have a question, or you'd like something clarified, please, I'm very happy actually to just be interrupted, and I would like for this to be as open as possible, rather than just me talking at a computer screen for an hour and a half. Because that's lame. I'll give it just a brief bit of introduction about what I'm going to talk about, and in particular how it relates to the piece that you'll hear tomorrow, or some of you will hear tomorrow. So for the last few years, I've been working on a project, on a kind of series of projects that connect to self-portraits, paintings, that are self-portraits, in particular two self-portraits by the painter Gerhard Richter, which I'll talk about in some detail, and then more recently this self-portrait by Francis Bacon, which is the painting that the piece tomorrow is based on. And so I thought, rather than just talk about the piece that's being presented tomorrow, is another familiar face. There's a bunch of Huddersfield students scattered around in the. that's a nice thing to see. So what I'll try and do is spend most of my time talking about these two existing works. So there are these two quartets, which I'll describe in just a second, and then that's a way to kind of set up some of the issues that are present in the new electronic piece that premieres tomorrow. So as a kind of general overview, really what I want to talk about is the nature of the self-portrait. And the thing that I'm really interested in at the moment is that all self-portraits, whether that's paintings or other manifestations like mine in music, are about a kind of gap between what is real and what is fabricated or presented or manufactured as a kind of reality of how we want to present ourselves. And these particular paintings that I've been interested in do that in really interesting ways, where there's this constant play between between various kinds of layers and which things actually are the painter in question, and their kind of playfulness about how they then present themselves as people, as personalities through these paintings. And so I'll kind of talk about that in general, and then I'll try and tie that in with some specific things about these two recent pieces from the last 2 years, and then also the Bacon piece that premieres tomorrow. So the two acoustic pieces, two ensemble pieces, are part of a set called A Way of Making Ghosts, which is kind of the title that I've used for this talk today. They're both quartets. They're both based on the self-portraits by the German painter Gerhard Richter. They exist basically as mirror images of one another, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The instrumentation, well, in fact, maybe I'll save that and I'll tell you all of that stuff in a bit more detail in a minute. But across both pieces, they use a number of really unusual approaches to instrumentation, unusual approaches to notation in particular, both in terms of instrumental notation and then the notation of rhythm. And then loads of very strange performance techniques, which I'll walk you through in a little bit of detail along the way. So they use this extended tablature notation that I've been working with pretty much consistently since 2004. So I haven't really been working with pitches in most of my work since 2004. There are pitches that start to appear in these last two pieces. But instead working with movements of players and the ways in which players interact with their instruments in a physical way. These two recent pieces do some more unusual things with those kinds of approaches. In particular, brass instrument parts where the instruments are taken apart and tubing is rerouted or left undone. Lots of work with very strange kinds of mutes or coverings. There's a whole collection of approaches in the piccolo part in the second quartet using these strange kind of trumpet embouchures and gasket kind of techniques, which again I'll describe in a bit. So all of that has been about creating a situation where there is a strange kind of ambiguity in terms of what the material is. So all of those things are about a kind of smearing or covering or distorting, creating a kind of ambiguity about whether those distortions or modifications of instruments or of playing techniques are distortions of an original material, and it's the original that was important, and then that thing is smeared, or if in fact the smearing itself is the material. And that's something that I hope will become clear when we look at the Gerhard Richter paintings in a minute. What I want to do before I talk anymore is play some music, just so you have some sense of what these pieces sound like. This is the first of the two quartets. I'm going to play the second half of it, which will take about 6 minutes or so. The piece is called Self-Portrait 3 Times Standing, and it's based on a collection of 6 images by Richter, which I'll show you when the piece finishes. This is a live performance this is the Elysian Ensemble conducted by Carl Rosman in a performance from, I guess about 2 years ago now. Is that right? A year ago, year and a half ago, from the National the National Concert Hall in Taipei, in Taiwan. I will try to share the screen so you can see some of the notation as well. So let me see if I can make this all work now. I think that's going to work. So can you now see the score?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you very much. And hopefully you'll also be able to hear it, and hopefully it'll play in stereo now that we have this fancy new option in Zoom. So as I say, it'll take about 6 minutes. So that's the second half of this piece for tenor saxophone, trombone, piano, and double bass, called Self-Portrait 3 Times Standing. And what I'd like to do now is kind of walk you through these paintings, and I'll kind of introduce some of the ideas behind the painting, some of the things that I found interesting about the paintings, and then talk a little bit about some of the links between those paintings and these two pieces. And then what I'll do after that is play all of the second quartet, which is called Self-Portrait 1996. So I've got to go back into screen sharing mode for a bit, and I also need to turn off that. There we go. So this should now. I think now you're seeing some slides. Yeah. So a couple of quick things. I promised I would mention a bit about the notation and some of the performance approaches. You've seen now some of the notation for the first piece. There's an example from the second piece on the right hand side. There's nowhere near enough time in this talk to go through everything that I'm doing, but I'll try and give you a couple of specific introductions. One thing I definitely don't have time to talk about is the rhythmic approach. But if anyone is interested, there's a lecture floating around on YouTube that talks about this approach to rhythmic notation and metrical notation, called Imagining a Non-Geometric Rhythm. But I'll just give you some little introductions to some of the more unusual performance techniques and notations. So this, for example, that you're seeing here is an example from the tenor saxophone part from the quartet that you just heard. And the staff along the top is a kind of rhythmic staff. As I say, I can't talk about it in detail today, but the basic principle is that basically any beat can be of any speed or any duration, and those are constantly changing through every bar. The middle line, this kind of multicolored line, I think you can see my cursor, my mouse. So that kind of central line is all of the activity of the embouchure, so that is breath, lips, tongue, and in this particular case, working with Josh Hyde, who's the saxophonist from this performance. We were doing a lot of work around voicing, around saxophone voicing. So a lot of the more unusual techniques, and in fact, some of the colors that are present here are about this shifting in the kind of the back of the oral cavity, which is about a kind of strange placement, which enables some unusual timbres and also some strange kind of registral things. And then the main kind of the bottom third of this image is all of the activity of the fingers and keys using a kind of bespoke tablature system that I've developed. The red stuff is just trills. So that's showing what fingers are depressing what keys when. This is a brief excerpt from the double bass part, again from the same piece. I guess I'll describe this one from the bottom to the top. The staff, the main part of the staff, is the full vibrating length of the string. So the top of that staff is the bridge. The bottom of that staff is the nut at the top of the fingerboard. This stretch here, so up until this line, is the full length of the fingerboard. The middle line here is the point at which the body of the instrument comes into contact with the neck, just as a kind of point of reference. All of the black information is movements of the left hand up and down the strings. It specifies what finger is depressing which string on the instrument, and then everything else is notated graphically. So widths of fingers and finger pressure are all notated graphically. The red is, I don't know if that's for me to click on, but I'm going to do it anyway. The red is the motion of the bow. So, and again, that is both up and down the length of the string, and then also thickness of line. It primarily refers to pressure, and then the circles indicate which string the bow is in contact with. The green at the top is up and down bow motion, and you'll see that those things are often independent. So you have motion up and down the string from the right hand of the bow, which is separate from the up and down motion. That is again a kind of graphical indication, with the tip of the bow and the frog of the bow, so that an up bow goes up on that staff and a down bow goes down on that staff. And you'll see often I'm playing with kind of curves and speeds of those movements. And then one final example that gives a little indication of the kinds of things that are happening in the brass part. This is from the second piece that I'll play you in a bit, called Self-Portrait 1996. This is from the horn part. And there are a few unusual things here. The first is, you'll see over on the left-hand side that some of the valves have been taken off. In this case, both the B-flat valve and Christine Chapman, who I was working with from Musikfabrik on this piece, has a double bell horn, and that second bell also uses the same mechanism as a small quarter tone valve. And so that quarter tone valve and the B-flat valve can both be removed. This is the one spot in the piece where they're both removed. What that means is when that valve is engaged, so for example, when you would be switching back and forth between the B-flat side and the F side of the horn, instead of that happening, the air is now escaping through the opening in that tube. And as it happens, the quarter tone valve and the B-flat valve point in different directions. So you get these really interesting kind of antiphonal elements that sound almost like a kind of piccolo trumpet. So now I can send stuff out the bell of the horn or out of either of these two kind of short-circuited valves. The main kind of central part of this staff is movements of the embouchure. This is just tension of the lips from high to low, and then a series of kind of unusual performance techniques, various kinds of modifications and split tones and noisy materials with growling and various kinds of flutter and breath content. The middle of the staff is so the top line is the thumb, so that is the control of the F or B flat valve depending on the instrument. And then also the quarter tone valve is specified on that staff. This is the action of the valves from the fingers, and then the bottom of that staff is anything either working with the mute. There's lots of material with harmon mutes where I'm opening and closing the opening of the mute, or motion of the hand in and out of the bell. So all of that is indicated as kind of physical movements. So that's some kind of basic information about some of the things that I've done from a musical standpoint. Now we're going to switch gears and look at some paintings. That piece, Self-Portrait 3 Times Standing, is based on this collection of 6 paintings by Richter, all of which are here. The backdrop of each one of the 6 paintings is the same. So they're all the same photograph. And I'll show you some close-ups in just a second. In fact, maybe I can do that here. Yeah. It's a triple exposed image of Richter in his studio. So you can see that's him and that's him, and I can't remember where the other one is. I can't see it on my screen, sorry. Oh, sorry, there, and there. Those are, so Richter appears 3 times in this kind of triple exposed image, and then there are a series of overpaintings. So this comes from his collection of overpainted photographs, and each of the 6 images use the same photograph, and they are overpainted in different ways. I've arranged them here just in terms of density, so you'll see they get thicker and thicker. These use his traditional kind of squeegee technique with this thick red paint, which gets thicker and thicker, overlaying over top of those that original image. to the point in which the final one, all of the pictures of Richter himself are gone, right? You can't actually see Richter in the self-portrait. So there are a number of things that I find really fascinating about this. I mean, one is that you have in this thing which is a self-portrait, right? A painting of oneself, a representation of oneself as an artist. The thing that is most clearly him, right? The picture of him is the most clearly fake, right? It's totally fabricated. It's a fabricated setup with this triple exposed image. It's not something that ever existed in real life. Any of those three images and their superimposition is this strange kind of contrivance, which strikes me as a kind of unusual thing for a self-portrait. And then you have this act of painting over top of it, of totally obscuring anything that is a picture of him as the artist. And one of the things that I got interested in is the fact that that obscuring, even just the kind of physical act of painting over top of a photograph, starts to raise all sorts of really interesting questions about, I suppose, even the things that are most directly connected back to Richter as a painter. And in this case, the paint actually is the thing that is most directly and most real, right? It's the thing that is most clearly connected to Richter's hand, Richter's action as an artist, and even becomes kind of revealing in a more kind of personal or emotional way of taking this paint and covering up a picture of himself. The other thing that this painting, or this collection of 6 paintings, does for me personally is it creates this really fascinating space around depth and perception and surface. So our normal sense of looking at a photograph, we kind of, in fact, even in the first example, in the one on the top left there, we kind of make an allowance as viewers for what's happening in an image like that, of where things are in a space, in a real space, in this case, in his studio. And for me, what happens with this collection of 6 paintings is that the more paint is present, in fact, even just the act of painting on top of the photograph in the first place, does this really fascinating thing where that 3-dimensional space of the image, of the actual space of his studio, is immediately collapsed. So you are suddenly totally aware of the falseness of the photograph, right? The photograph now becomes very much about the actual physical print, the paper that is the photograph. And for me, that kind of comes from this act of adding what is clearly a 3-dimensional thing on top of it. So you have this 3-dimensional space of the image, which is suddenly flattened into this 2-dimensional thing, and it becomes total surface. And then there is this 3-dimensionality that comes from something which is overlaid. So that's something that I play with quite a lot in the piece that you've just heard. There are lots of things around layering and stacking and varying kinds of, you will have probably seen in the score that the material keeps kind of breaking apart, that instruments go off on their own. There are lots of kind of independent soloistic kinds of materials. And also all the way through that piece, I'm constantly playing with which thing is kind of background and which thing is foreground, or what happens when you take a very simple kind of musical material and then by distorting all of these things with embouchure or with performance techniques, that it completely obliterates whatever that background information was. But now all of a sudden the obliteration becomes its own kind of material, and it reveals certain things about the original. I'll come back to that, and we'll have some chances to talk about it, I think, in more detail when we have some questions. But I want to talk a little bit about the other painting and then play the whole of that piece. So this is Self-Portrait 1996, also by Richter, and is easily one of my all-time favorite paintings. I absolutely adore this painting. In many ways, it's a much more traditional self-portrait, right? It is a painting. It's clearly a painting of him. It's a painting of himself. I'll show this in more detail in a second, but like the first example, it's based on a photograph. In fact, quite a lot of Richter's work, certainly his self-portraits, draw on photographs. And the things here that I find really beautiful, the face is kind of deflected, the gaze is hidden, you can't really see the face or the facial expressions. There's something really earnest about the painting and quite exposed and vulnerable, and it has this kind of, I don't know, it's quite beautiful and strangely sad for me in a way I find really beautiful. You'll also possibly see I don't know quite how it will look on your screens, but you might be able to see, so like if you follow my mouse here, you can see there are these lines that are overlaid. So, and I still don't actually know how he's done this. I think it's with his fingers, but it might be with a brush. But there's this grid that's pulled over top as a kind of final layer. So there are a couple of things. First, you have this image, which is weird and hazy and covered and quite distant. And there's, you know, he has used his typical kind of light kind of brushing technique over the top of the image as it's drying, which gives it this weird kind of distant hazy element. So everything feels like it's just kind of out of reach, that you can't quite get a sense of what the image is. But then he does this thing where he comes across over top of it with his fingers or whatever else, at pulling on the paint on the top of the canvas. And for me, again, that does exactly the same thing in an opposite way of what happened in the overpainted photographs. Suddenly, with that streaking, you're drawn to the fact of the surface of the paint, right? It goes from being a painting as an image of someone, and all of a sudden, with that kind of that pulling over the surface, with that grid, you start to see the surface of the paint and the gap between the surface of the paint and the image, as it were, the thing that is. So now, like, the self-portrait becomes the background again, because there's this strange separation between, well, but I guess again, between what is real and what is fake. The real in this case suddenly becomes the reality of the paint, the reality of the surface, the reality of the kind of finger drawing along the top. So that's the first part of this. There's an extra layer which I really like, that I think maybe, yeah, I'll come back to the source of this image in a bit after we do some more listening. I'm going to turn the slides off. Yeah, good. Yeah, so a couple of things. The first is, as I mentioned, these two quartets are mirror images of themselves. I kind of see those two paintings as being sort of mirrors of one another. The first quartet is very much outward and external. All of its energies are kind of outward energies. And it's constantly playing with solos versus accompaniments of things that are together or that then break apart, or of a kind of stacking or layering, all the way through. That first quartet, Self-Portrait 3 Times Standing, is about overlaying, of taking something and stacking things over top of it. And often that stacking is about a kind of distortion or obfuscation or smearing. And there's also a really important part of well, in fact, of both pieces, that is highly referential and kind of representational. That is, it's drawing on existing materials, which again, I'll talk about in more detail in a bit. The second quartet is totally the opposite of that. The second quartet is inward, it's internal. Instead of the kind of solo versus accompaniment, everything is together all of the time. All of the behaviors are tutti behaviors across all of the ensemble. And the kind of sound world of that second quartet is, I'm trying to do this thing which is, again, very sort of personal and vulnerable, but also creates this sense of distancing, of separation. Everything feels like it's hazy, kind of hinted at that it's behind some kind of curtain or gaze. That second quartet, there are no layers. Everything is kind of internal, and it's all about these kind of magnetized orbits where things are kind of drawn in together. But then there is this element, like the second painting I showed you, of these kind of grids or blocks, things that are superimposed, that feel very much like they are overlaid over top of the surface of material that kind of pulls it into different directions. Both of those pieces, there is this sense of kind of the two pieces together being mirrors of one another, but they also, all of the working methods are all about mirrors and mirroring, both kind of mirrors as a kind of material or as a kind of strategy, but also thinking about notions of mirrors and the self from a more philosophical standpoint. And so part of that is that from a let's say a practical standpoint, that mirroring is about duplication, about reflection, about replication, about depiction, but then also about illusion and impression, and again this kind of play between what is real and what is fake. That is, what is self-projection or self-deception. And throughout this whole project, one of the things I've been really interested in is what happens in effect when we look in the mirror on a very personal level, and the kind of reality that is not us, right? That is not really who we are. More often than not, the faces that we make or how we pose in front of a mirror is about how we want to be seen, and certainly having had the experience of doing 6 months now of Zoom and having to confront the reality of doing a lecture like this, and I can see myself, right? And that's totally different from how you might behave when you don't see yourself, when you're just up in front of a room full of people. So some of those issues are very much a part of what I'm thinking about at the moment as a composer. What I want to do now is, if I can, I think we're okay for time. What I'd like to do is play the whole piece. I think I've got enough time to do that. It's a 14-minute piece. So the piece is called Self-Portrait 1996. This is the one that's based on the second image. This is again a live performance. This is Ensemble Musikfabrik with me conducting, which was maybe the most fun I've ever had in my life. From a concert in March, literally a day before the lockdown started. So this was, I think, March 10th. I flew home and then everything shut down. And I've been in this chair ever since. And then I think what we'll do after playing it, there'll be some time, I think, for some more open questions. And then I'll try and bring back some of the larger issues around kind of questions about self-portraits. So this will take me 2 seconds to get all of these bits and pieces going. I need to turn that on. I need to share the screen. You can now see the score. I need to skip ahead a bunch to, there we go. And now I think probably you're hearing audio, and I need to mute myself so that you're not hearing it through my speakers. So, I don't know what you would all like to do. We have about half an hour. I have some other things that I can show you. I'd like to talk a little bit about the piece for tomorrow, but this seems like maybe a useful time to open things up if there are any initial questions from those two pieces, and as I say, I can show you some additional stuff about both the pieces or the paintings. Any questions?
Excuse me. I would like to ask, when you work with tablatura, how do you deal with the change of musician on instrument? Because you never will have the same result at the same tablatura with different instruments and performancer. So what do you think about that, and what you thought?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, because my answer to that probably is different now than it would have been 10 years ago. For my earlier work, working with tablature, that gap was really important to me, and that was very much part of the reason why I was working with tablature, right? So what was interesting for me was that it was possible to take the same physical gesture and transfer that from, I'll give a very specific example. The very first piece of mine that works with this extensively is a piece called The Crutch of Memory for solo string instrument, which has a huge range of kind of variabilities in terms of scordatura and what instrument can be used. It can be any string instrument. And what I was interested in that case is that you could have a situation in which physical movements could be replicated over and over again. The same kind of physical movement can be done by different people on different instruments and generate totally different kinds of results certainly in terms of pitch material, but also to a certain extent in terms of timbre or whatever else, and have it still be very much the same thing. And that has been really interesting for me all along. It's a question of kind of reorienting what we think of when we think about material, what constitutes material. And I think this whole project for me for 20 years now has been about creating a focus on the kinds of energies, gestures, movements that create sound, and seeing that as being musical material in its own right. More recently, that's the level of indeterminacy is lower. So in some of my earlier work, for example, working with wind instruments, the tablature has only ever referred to movements of the fingers and intentionally has avoided any specificity about keys or buttons. That's been left intentionally open-ended. So there's another piece based on some Francis Bacon paintings called "And the Scream, Bacon's Scream is the operation through which the entire body escapes through the mouth, or 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion." And that piece is 11 years old now, I think. And that piece is quite open in its tablature. And you'll notice here in the notation for the contrabass clarinet or E-flat clarinet or piccolo, or in the previous piece, the notation for the tenor saxophone, the keys are very much specified. And so there's less variability. I think I'm probably in this more recent work working with things that are a little bit more, not necessarily predictable, but the intentionality of the sound is perhaps a little bit clearer. And that's something I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. I'll show you some other stuff to connect it to the paintings that is about some of these questions. Well, yeah, I'll save that. I'll tell you more about that in a bit.
Okay, thanks. I have more questions, but if another person has one, I'll leave him the ball.
Great.
Hey, hi. I would like to know, how do you, if you think of structure, how do you think of structure when you're structuring the sound and in general? It's just I'm curious about it. How do you work with sound masses or with different types of parameters, the density of parameters? Are you conscious about it, or you just throw it like that?
So, I mean, as it happens, my answer to that question is almost exactly the same as my answer to the last question, which is that is something that has changed very much in my work over the last 20 years, and that's connected again, actually, all to some of these same questions around notions of the self and some of the questions around self-portraits. So, for my work from 1998 until 2015. Roughly, I was working in a very prescriptive, highly methodological kind of way, highly systematic kind of way, and often working with forms that were kind of emergent forms. So I was working a lot with very local level control of materials, with these kind of independent loops and cycles that would accumulate, and any larger structures would be about the accumulation of that activity on a local level. So a really simple example, I might have a couple of independent loops, and any moment where those loops might correspond, that would generate a higher order organizational unit. And if that was happening then on several layers, something that had 3 nodal points versus 7 nodal points, 7 nodal points would have a stronger degree of structural significance. There would be tempo changes or higher levels of differentiation, whatever. But all of those things were always the result of local level materials. I went through a strange kind of period as a composer starting around 2012, 2013, where I don't know, I started rethinking how I was making pieces. I wanted to kind of not throw it all out, but I had a sense that for my work to move to the next level, to do the next thing that I wanted it to do in terms of expressivity, the only way that I could really do that was to rethink how I started pieces, to go back to first principles. And so I wrote this piece called The Recoformer Boundaries, which is 2014 to 2016. And I started, for the first time since I was a little kid, I started with a blank piece of paper. I had no idea what I was going to do. I had no idea what I was going to make. I knew it had to be half a concert. It had to be 35 minutes long. I knew the instrumentation, and that's it. That's all I knew. And in fact, it took me, I was more than a year into the process of making the piece before anything about form emerged at all. So it was all very much working like a, I don't know, like the analogy that I've used previously is that my earlier work was very much like working like an architect, thinking very much in terms of structures and kind of mechanisms and relationships between those mechanisms. And then this period around the Recoformer Boundaries. And by the way, I should say that came very much from having started to work with electronics for the first time. So my first electronic piece is 2013. I had never worked in the studio before. I hated electronic music. I didn't understand why anyone would do it or listen to it. And that's exactly why I started making it, because it forced me into this situation that was totally unfamiliar. I had to rethink things I thought I knew, things I thought I was certain about, I had to be uncertain about. And that kind of led to this period of working in a very different way and feeling like I had to completely rethink how I started a piece and get rid of all of my assumptions about what my music did. So I did that. I'm very proud of that piece, but there are a bunch of things that don't work in a way that I would want them to work. And so I'm kind of going through this thing at the moment, and say over the last 2 or 3 years, where I'm starting to kind of integrate those two worlds and trying to find ways of thinking structurally that are about, particularly about behaviors. I mean, I guess that's the most direct way to answer your question, is that at the moment, the way I think about forms and structures is almost entirely about modes of operation. So I'm thinking a lot about behaviors either on instruments or behaviors in terms of interactions between instruments or between kinds of materials. So that's almost all of how I'm working. And the thing that's been really tricky in this more recent work, in trying to get rid of some of those more rigid, more architectural systems, I lost the frame that was necessary for, my working method has never been about determining what happens in what order So like my sketching never specified what would happen. My sketching has always been about creating kind of worlds or windows of opportunities within which I can make decisions. And when I lost the frame, when I got rid of the kind of pre-planning, I didn't know how to do that anymore. I had no idea what to respond to or react against. And so in these more recent pieces, I've tried to kind of reintroduce that, but in a kind of fuzzy way. And I've tried to design, I guess maybe the way to describe it is that I'm trying to design dynamic forms, that is structures that are kind of flexible, or that are about kind of vibration or magnetism, within which then I react or I respond, if that makes sense. So maybe it's a kind of sculptural way of thinking rather than an architectural way of thinking, so that I'm responding to, if I were working with wood, right, I'm responding to the knots in the wood, or the, you know, the thickness of, or whatever, marble, or, you know, those kinds of sculptural analogies. What I don't do still is, you know, decide when I start how long a piece is going to be and what the shapes are going to be. That still is something that emerges through the interactions between behaviors on a more local instrumental level.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else while we're here? Let me show you some more stuff about these paintings, because this is a cool little bit, and I have someone who is here as a. Sorry, I'm just clicking admit to whoever it is who wanted to be admitted. Yeah, this is kind of a good way to kind of wrap things up, but also to set up the piece for tomorrow. I'll show you a couple more things about the paintings, and this requires me sharing my screen again. I think you can now see that. So a lot of what I've been working through, and I guess, you know, this kind of came up with those two questions, is reworking. And one of the things I love about the self-portrait as a kind of genre, almost, certainly in painting, is that so many painters keep working through this problem, the kind of problem of the self-portrait, and they keep making the same kind of thing over and over again. And both Richter and Francis Bacon are really good examples of that. So as it happens, Self-Portrait 1996, there is another painting called Self-Portrait 1996. Similar kinds of approaches. I need to move my screen to be able to see that. Yeah, I mean, you can even see in the catalog raisonné numbers are just off by one. And Self-Portrait 3 Times Standing is itself also a kind of reworking of another collection of overpainted photographs, exactly the same setup, in this case called Self-Portrait 3 Times Seated, I think. So it's still triple exposure. He's in his studio with the camera is even clearly in the same place. You can see that the dates for the images and the dates of the paintings are totally different, but he's tried to kind of recreate this same environment. And again, it has the overpainting. And so for me, in my own work, part of what this kind of project around thinking about self-portraits has been about reworking, working through, trying again, but also about acknowledging that in my work, there's been a kind of gap between, I think this is true for every artist, there's a gap between what I wanted to make and what I actually made, right? And that's why we keep doing it. We don't make a perfect piece. We always make imperfect pieces, even when we make great pieces, they're not quite right. And so we try again, and we keep trying again. And I'm trying to do that in a very kind of specific way at the moment, which is my early work, in part because of how I was working and how I was thinking about instruments, how I was thinking about notation, was very much about inventing a vocabulary, opening up a world for myself, very much about exploring new approaches to instruments and new kinds of sounds. But it also prioritized invention. I'm at a point at the moment where I'm really interested in, so again, the sort of analogy that I've used is that early work was very much about creating a vocabulary, and my work at the moment is about creating a kind of grammar or syntax of working with that vocabulary, trying to make something that has a more sophisticated way of controlling that vocabulary. And so there's been this kind of direct effort to go back to the well, to go back to things that I've used before, specific techniques, specific approaches to instruments, and find new ways of working through that or working with them. The other big kind of connection between the Richter paintings and my own work is that the Richter self-portraits, not just these, but all of the self-portraits, always work with existing material, kind of repurposed material, and pretty much always photographs. And here, sorry. Yeah, so self-portrait 1996, the source of the second piece, it comes from Richter's Atlas collection, which is his this massive collection of all of his source materials. So you can see here on the lower right-hand side, the original image, and there it is up close. And the moment I saw this, like, I had already loved the painting, and this was like a totally different level. So you can see I think he's at a dinner party. He's got a drink in his hand. And so like the image that we see, which is, this beautiful kind of vulnerable, exposed, distant, hazy kind of thing in the painting, all of that comes from taking this totally ordinary, banal photograph of a totally ordinary kind of setting, and a totally incongruous setting compared to what ends up happening in the painting. And all he's done is he's cropped it and rotated it, and it completely changes the nature of the image. And so this got me thinking quite a lot about notions of kind of reference and of repurposing or reusing material from other places, from and indeed in my case, kind of other musics. The first quartet that I played you, Self-Portrait 3 Times Standing, does this in some fairly explicit ways, in particular with references to jazz. All the keyboard part, the piano part is all based around my total obsession with the late Coltrane quartet, the main kind of Coltrane quartet, in particular McCoy Tyner, and then references to Art Tatum and Cecil Taylor is pretty obvious, and Thelonious Monk is pretty obvious as well in some of the kind of splayed performance techniques. And the saxophone part has really direct links to Coltrane and other kind of mid to late 60s saxophonists. But all of that again is connected to this broader question, which is about this relationship between what is real and what is fake in the self-portrait. What thing is actually me? What is the actual self? What about that is honest, and what about that is a kind of covering or hiding, a kind of obfuscation, like that in the way that we try and project ourselves, often we are hiding who it is that we are. So with that in mind, I'm gonna show you the painting that the piece tomorrow is based on. This is a piece painting by Francis Bacon called Study for Self-Portrait 1964. And if you don't mind, what I'd really like to do is just read the program notes. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible to print the program notes for the piece tomorrow, and I ended up writing a kind of essay because, well, you'll see why in a second. But if you don't mind, I'll just read them word for word, and then I think I'll probably wrap it up, and we can have time for a few more questions, and then call it a day. So these are the notes for the piece that you'll hear tomorrow. This started off as a very different piece. I'd been working on an 8-channel work with a significant improvisational live electronics component, and then the pandemic hit. Suddenly, I was stuck with my stereo home studio, and it wasn't particularly clear at what point in the future, months, years, ever, that it would be possible to perform in live, in-person concerts again. So I put that piece on pause. And then the quiet, the sadness, the death of the pandemic became overwhelming. There was a new stillness, an isolation, but also an unbearable awareness that the very personal experience of death was being repeated at such a scale that people became numbers, and then numbers in the thousands, and then hundreds of thousands. The music I'd been making suddenly felt not only inappropriate, but also irrelevant and thoroughly unwelcome amongst the severe separation of quarantine, the fear, the frozen uncertainty, and the unexpected renaturing of our cities that emerged through those months. It was a time to be quiet, to be still, to listen, to think, to worry. And then from there, or really in the middle of all of it, the protests in response to the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and an impossibly long list of countless others erupted in the USA, then spread worldwide. Thousands became tens of thousands, became millions, and an anger, an unwillingness to accept anything other than change, an immediacy of an impassioned call for long overdue justice. And the signs in the protests that I'll remember the most said simply enough, gripped us all, or at least most of us. I also then watched the president, my president, I suppose, attempt to call for martial law on live international television while we watched in baffled horror as otherwise peaceful protesters were attacked by the ostensibly protective police and military forces of their own state with tear gas and disfigured by rubber bullets. We watched as journalists were, in scenes repeated with shocking consistency across my country, assaulted, injured, and arrested. I went from not wanting to make any sound at all to wanting to make the most ferocious sound I've ever made. So this is that piece. But what does that have to do with the Francis Bacon self-portrait? I've been working through the idea of self-portraits a lot over the last few years, particularly in the work of Gerhard Richter, as well as Bacon. And in both cases, I'm particularly fascinated by the repetition of the self-portrait, of the making again, of the constant replication of a statement that says, at least through its title, "Here I am." I'm interested in the magnetic battle between honesty, vulnerability, and the personal on one hand, and the fabricated, the performed, the illusory on the other. All of my music for these last few years has revolved around an interrogation of those same issues. Where am I in my work? What are the elements of that work that are true, that are honest? What are the elements that are facades? What are the truths in those facades? What are the ways that musical compositional materials reveal or hide those truths? To wit, the body in Francis Bacon's self-portrait, which you can see here, isn't even his. It's copied from a photograph by John Deacon of the painter Lucian Freud, with Freud's head and face swapped out for Bacon's. But Bacon's approach to those materials is unmistakably his. Where does that line between real self and projected self fall? Doesn't that swapping tell us even more about Bacon than if it were his own body? Bacon's repeated use of, quote, study for self-portrait as a title was, if not an inspiration, then at least a source of permission to reuse titles in my own work, notably in the Recoformer Boundaries, a title I've assigned to 7 different pieces. Bacon's catalogue raisonné lists 53 self-portraits, 12 of which carry the title Study for Self-Portrait, spanning nearly 20 years. And I'm always struck by Bacon's use of the word study. This is not a study for another painting, for a self-portrait. This is a study as a working through, a working again, a trying again, a re-engagement with the same ideas, the same materials, the same sets of problems, of representation, of self, of the performed distortions of psychologies and intentions and emotions, of materials, of forms. And so what does that have to do with this piece? Here's what I love about that painting and why it so perfectly captures this moment we've all been living in for these many months. We've spent all our time alone, isolated, separate, distant. There's a loneliness, a sense of distorted temporality, of deep dislocation. To put it simply, our worlds have been reduced to our couch, our bed, our office chair, our kitchen table, our bodies twisted and contorted in our confined spaces, our little boxes, digital or otherwise. But then there's our heads, our faces, our thoughts. Those things are somehow linked. They join us together. They're expressive and emotional. They are angry and impatient and wailing. They rage, they explode, they cry. That juxtaposition of the quiet, separate stillness and the deep emotive togetherness and personness is, for me, the perfect depiction of where we've been, or at least what this time has felt like to me in the little world of my little English house in a little English village, so far away from the world, but so much a part of it. And then there's that splatter-coated box behind Bacon's head. Its completely preposterous otherness, its irrelevant geometries and dimensions, its strangeness, its force, its greediness, its utter pictorial and formal violence. I don't know what to make of it, but I love it. And I suspect it's the closest version of what this piece is. Violence, beats and twisted geometries, ciphers with references to interruptions, defects, codes, improvisational gatherings, brutally collapsed three-dimensionality, possibly a portal into a new way of being. So you can hear it tomorrow. Are there any last few questions? I mean, I guess the thing to say about all of that, and I hope it's clear in the notes for the piece tomorrow, is that a lot of what I've been working through is kind of about finding where I am in my work, why I make music at all, but in particular why I make the music that I do, and finding ways of being quite direct and personal and emotive in my work, and finding a way to do that with my own materials. And you know, I think what that's meant is my work is probably muddier than it was 10 years ago. I think it's probably less certain. I think it's probably less dogmatic. Some of that comes from getting older. I've joked with a number of people that I'm kind of writing middle period music at the moment, that I spent the early part of my career making a big mess, and now I'm going to spend, you know, a decade or two trying to figure out what to do with that mess. But for me, it's been kind of freeing. It's meant that I've found myself in a place where I've got stuff that I know is mine. I've got materials that I know are mine, and now I feel I have this kind of sense of responsibility that that I have to say something with those materials. And so I think that kind of explains some of the links to things that are quite overtly political, things that are quite overtly personal, and that's kind of I hope what you'll hear tomorrow. Any questions or responses or thoughts?
Hi again.
Hello.
I want to ask, because you were speaking about layering and superposing and like distorting or asking what's the real thing. So parallel to that process of overlapping, there is, well, I think like that multiphonics for the second piece you played, a sense of doing the reverse process, like trying to go into sound as at the time you try to overlap, you try to go into it. I am right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, there are a few things. Probably the contrabass clarinet multiphonics in particular is part of what you're thinking of. That it's so fascinating. I mean, the world that can be opened up, and you'll see in the notation that for example, in the very quiet bit towards the end with the very high bass clarinet dyads. It's all off a single fingering, right? All of that stuff is happening. It's just within the control of the embouchure, and there are similar things that happen in some of the other parts. And yeah, I think you're right that there are these places where things kind of flip in on themselves. Like all of a sudden, you're living inside of a technique rather than that happening, you know, like in the fast bits, those same things happen. It's just that they happen in a fraction of a second. And I'm trying to do these things. One of the, I mentioned that I'm working a lot with behaviors, and that piece literally has one behavior, which is it's playing with things that are about freezing. And I'm kind of playing with different ways of imagining the notion of stasis. where you can have stasis, which is about a frenetic energy that stops, like pressing pause on, you know, like fast forwarding and then pressing pause is a totally different kind of sense of stasis than that kind of glacial, slow kind of shifting. We have different understandings of what the materials are. So a lot of it's around these kind of interruptions or elongations. And the other element in that piece, which I think is connected to your question, is that everything is about transition in that piece. Everything is about moving from one state to another state. It's always about it's that was some of how I dealt with the sense of kind of distancing in the painting, of being away from the image, so that you never grasp what the material is. The material is always on its way to becoming something else. So, and sometimes that same feature that you've identified emerges from that. So in those transitions, you know, the relationship to the material changes, and so you have that sense of kind of going inside of the sound. Other questions?
Yeah. Hi, Aaron.
Hello, Jose. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too. I was wondering about whether you could expand a little more on your choosing of the original sources, because that's
which original sources, the paintings or the musical references or the paintings?
The musical references. I mean, well, because I know you've talked about the juxtaposition and the transition as material itself, but behind those transitions and modifications and transformations, there's always some kind of, I mean, the piano parts in the first quartet that kind of shine in there, and I was wondering how does that relate to your idea of self-portrait?
Yeah, I can answer that really quickly. It requires opening a browser window. Hold on. Actually, I think maybe I have it on the computer already. Hold on. I think I've got the video saved. Yeah, good. Oh, that's going to be harder than this. Hold on. Does that answer your question? Yeah, Jose, really the answer is that that's one of my favorite things in the entire world. Like that's my favorite music. Those are my favorite musicians, my very favorite musicians. I've lived with that music every day for 25 years. And it's starting to kind of come through in my work in a more explicit way. I mean, that's just one example. There are lots of others, but that's probably the most overt. You know, like the big, like, you know, openly spaced block chords and the vamping, like it's all really direct. My notes for the piece include, like, it literally originally in the score, it even would mention McCoy Tyner by name, or Cecil Taylor by name, or, you know, it wasn't an oblique reference. It was very clear, like, direct reference. I'm aware that we're probably out of time.
I have a question. Is it possible?
Fine for me.
Yes.
Let's say it's the last question.
Okay. Like a pianist, the jazz. I know the reference is clear. It's totally clear. But I have a question is about the communication. I know your piece, your score, and I love it. But I didn't know this. Sorry, I have a lag. No. I want to ask you. Sorry. I have two computer. Do you listen to me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Yes.
That's great.
Yeah, I have a electric computer. Excuse me. It's great. I have electric computer. Now, I think it's better. No. Let's see now. No? Hello?
Yeah, just go on. We hear
Okay.
you. Yeah.
I want to ask you
Ask away.
the problem about the communication, because I'm really impressive about what he said about the relationship with the painter, relationship with the aesthetic things. When I listen to your music, I don't know nothing about your right. For me, it's very interesting, but how you can explore or can connect these kind of things with the music, like a composer, a young composer. I'm very interested about this, because the note, the program note, is very different. That I feel different. That I love it. How you feel it? How you work about this? Because for me, this idea is very interesting. I didn't know that you think like that when I listen to your music, and I study your music, and when I listen to you, for me it's very, very interesting. If you have something to say about this, for me,
yeah. So a couple of things. I'll be quick because we're definitely out of time. But for me, the entire the world of a piece isn't just what happens inside of the piece, and I don't think that's different for me than from pretty much any other composer. That, you know, contexts and I'm really careful about things like that around how I write about my work. Things like program notes, even titles, all of that's something that for me is really important. And I guess what I'm trying to create is a kind of network of potential points of resonance or connections that help create a kind of window of understanding. So so for me, it isn't necessarily problematic that you hadn't made that connection previously, but that connection is there to be made, right? That there is information that is out in the world, and I do these kinds of talks, and I do guest lectures, and I write about my work and whatever. And what I try to be incredibly candid and quite honest in how I talk about my work, in part because for me it helps make it clear that what I've been doing all along, and what I try to do is, like, I'm trying to make art. And art is about people, and so it isn't an academic exercise. It isn't something that lives on the page. I've never, like, I'm certainly aware of what my work looks like, and I'm aware of some of the problems that causes, but it's always been about making sound in a way that I find moving, or exciting, or inspiring, or whatever. It's for me, it's always a way of making it clear that what we're doing is being humans. So I hope that answers the question to a certain degree. But the other thing I'll say is, I hope you get to hear the piece tomorrow, because I think it's probably, Oriol has heard it. It's quite direct. I think you probably figure it out on just from hearing it.
I can tell. So thank you again. Thank you so much, Aaron, for this lecture, and we really hope that you'll be able to come in the future. We'll try to invite you again. And see you tomorrow in the concert for those being in Barcelona, and there is also another concert on Saturday morning. So thank again to all of you, and see you next time.
Thanks very much, all. I really appreciate it.